And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the introduction to using layer styles and creating special effects. It's a really interesting and fun dynamic within Adobe Photoshop that you can add specific styles to your layers. And I'm going to introduce you to your Layers panel, how to select special effects from a drop-down box or also from your layer styles. And also we'll go through adjusting using special effects to combine with layer masks and create some kind of interesting adjustments to your images using the combination of the two. So let's take a look at a very simple example. Here is an example of where text has been used with a drop shadow effect and the multiply blending mode to kind of create this text effect on this image. So let's take a look at how this was made. First of all, I started with a background, and then what I was going to want to do is just type my text. So I can type the text here, and probably I'm just going to start with a white color. I can actually just get to my default colors here in the Tools panel by selecting black and white, and then I can swap. Now I've got foreground white. That's probably the quickest way. And then I'm going to utilize a fairly thick typeface. Let's just choose Impact again because that seems to be fairly standard on all systems and probably would be available to you for practice. So I'm going to create a text layer, and I might type in, let's use caps lock so you can see here, here's a text layer. Oops, would be great if I could spell. Okay, and now this text layer, I can actually use my text tool and I can change the size of it in my tool options bar. Let's make it a little bigger so it's something easy to see. And I can do a few other adjustments to it if I need to. I can use my move tool to move that text layer around. Move it wherever I see fit. And then the next thing that I'd want to do is add a layer style to it. You can access layer styles in two different manners. One way is here under Layer, Layer Style, and I can choose one of these layer styles from here, or I can use my Layers panel and choose the FX drop-down menu. I'm going to move that up so that you can see a little bit more of that FX panel. I can choose drop shadow, outer glow, bevel and emboss. So there's different types of effects that I can choose here. So in the case that you saw, the original case, I just chose a drop shadow effect. When I choose drop shadow, Photoshop will bring up this layer style dialog box. And it helps if I can actually see what's happening with preview checked. And if I click on this layer style here, now I can adjust and change what's going on to this drop shadow. I can adjust the distance of that shadow. You can see it could get very far away from the text or be relatively close. It just depends on how much I want it to punch out of the background. I can change the spread, like how much of, how big those letter forms are when they are in shadow form. I can change the size of the anti-aliasing. You can see that it can just become a real big dark blur and you can't even tell it's a shadow anymore if I bump that up too much. And also the way that this drop shadow is applied, certain different contours, whether or not it's anti-aliased to the background, how much noise I want to add to that drop shadow. You can see as I increase noise, it starts to look very mottled and pixelated, so I don't really want a lot of noise. I might want it to be a little softer, so I can change the opacity of that drop shadow. Don't want it to be too obnoxious. And I can also change the blending mode. I can, give it a color burn. You can see that it darkens but still allows the colors below to show up, so you can actually play with the blending modes a little bit. So all of these options become available to you when you choose a layer style. When I'm fairly happy with the effect that I've gotten, I can click OK. Watch what happens to the Layers panel. Immediately it shows that effects have been applied. And the cool thing is that I can actually turn those effects on and off. I can show effects, but I can turn off a specific effect. So I can actually add another effect if I'd like to. I can double click effects and I can choose, let's see, maybe let's give it, maybe we'll give a stroke around the text. You can see when I clicked on stroke, it added a 1 pixel black stroke around the letter forms. And then when I click on stroke, this actually brings up the information about that specific layer style versus turning on and off that layer style. So here's the subtle difference that you have to pay attention to. Selecting the layer style for adjustment and its specifics can be accessed here, or turning that adjustment on and off simply by unchecking or checking that layer style. And then of course you can adjust various things from there. And when you seem fairly happy with what you've done, you click OK. Boom, it adds another effect in our Layers panel. Well, I can mess around with this a little bit, but ultimately probably I might decide I don't really want to stroke that text, but I might want to play with my blending modes for this layer in the Layers panel. I can actually also play with the opacity of that specific layer. So I can pull the opacity down to sort of, give that more of a subtle effect in this case. Or I can change my blending modes. As I did in that case, I used multiply and it threw out everything that was white and just left the drop shadow effect, which resulted in this effect here. So using a combination of your layer effects, accessed through or layer styles, and then actual adjustments with the Layers panel using blending modes, and you can set the opacity of that specific layer, can be a very powerful tool when using them in combination. And just keep in mind that when you bring up the effects, you can double click on the effects in the Layers panel to bring them up, or you can go under Layer and Layer Style. So here's the layer style, and just remember that to select the options for a specific style, you have to actually click on that style and make those adjustments, and then turning on and off that style can be done by using the check mark. But you can show and hide, which is a little different than turning them on and off. You can show and hide effects by simply clicking the eyeball or deselecting the eyeball. Okay, so that's just an introduction to bringing up the layer styles. Let's take a look at sort of an advanced special effects that can be used when you have a combination of special effects and layer masks. So if I decide that I want to do something kind of weird, like maybe pretend that it just rained and create a puddle with a reflection of this building here, I can do that by using a combination of layer masks and layer styles. Let's see how this was done. The first thing that I did was I decided to make a selection where I wanted this puddle to live. So I just actually chose an elliptical marquee and kind of hold down the shift key and keep adding ellipses to this selection, and I start to make kind of a leftover rain puddle shape. So, whatever works for you when you practice. I just made a puddle shape. And the next thing that I did was I flipped the image vertically. And I did that by duplicating the original layer. And then I selected the duplicate layer and went under Layer, Edit, Transform, and Flip Vertical. So when I used that Flip Vertical transform, it gives me this. But when I still had the puddle selected, I actually clicked on the Add Layer Mask, and it masked the puddle for me. And it originally looked like this at 100%. So I had the puddle, I add the layer mask, and you can see the mask here to that puddle shape that I had made. And I ended up with this. Well, that's a little bright and not very believable, so what you probably want to do is play with the blending options. I went with overlay in this case, so kind of bring out the color of the pavement or the blacktop below, and then I brought down the opacity to make it look like a more believable reflection. And the next thing I wanted to do was, when you look at water on the ground, it kind of moves a little bit, especially if there's any sort of slight breeze going on. So I can actually add an effect to this layer by creating an overlay of a pattern. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So you can see I have added an effect. That's a pattern overlay. You can see when I turn it on and off. You can see how that little overlay looks. And I actually found it here. I went under Layer, Layer Style, Pattern Overlay. And it brings up the dialog box. And of course, this pattern is a bit much. So I might use my drop-down menu to select something that's a little more water-like, and you can still see that even that is a bit much. But I can actually adjust this layer style. I can manipulate it quite a bit. I can change the scale of this pattern, and you can see as I bump up the scale of that pattern, it gets more blurry and a little more nebulous, a little more water-like. So I made it really large in scale, and then I brought the opacity way down. So really we're just getting kind of a little cloudy reflection of that pattern overlay. You can also mess with the blending modes to kind of see. I used maybe a lighten blending mode, worked really well in this case because it just added the light areas of that pattern. And when I'm happy with this layer style, I click OK. And you can see here that I can turn those effects on and off and kind of mess with this a little bit, the combination, until I'm happy with and have created a relatively believable reflection of the building. So this is just an example of utilizing a combination of masks and layer styles to create a special effect like a reflection. The other thing that's interesting is if I actually use the link and unlink feature of the layer masks, I can unlink the two as I had done here, and I can move the image around using the Move tool. I select the image side of the layer, and I can move the image around until I see more or less of the building, depending on how I feel that reflection actually would be at that distance. So, it's a judgment call, of course, but I can move that image independently of the mask, as opposed to when it is linked, the two move together. And of course, once it gets up on the building, it loses all believability together. So that's how you can see the relationship between the image and the image mask once again. And this concludes an introduction to using a combination of layer masks and layer styles to create a special effect.